quite suddenly and unexpectedly, the pilots said, "Christ, there's the bridge." And they put the nose of the glider down very steeply. The next thing I knew was that there were sparks coming from the skids underneath. They didn't have wheels. And I thought these sparks were actually enemy fire, but they were in fact the skids striking the ground. And then there was an almighty crash, and I was thrown out through the side of the glider, actually, landed on the ground, still clutching my canvas bucket of grenades, which I had added at the last minute to that which I was carrying already in the way of ammunition, in order to, I suppose, engage the enemy more effectively. I had my Sten gun and the bayonet of it still fixed, but wasn't in any way hurt. The rest of the platoon got out of the glider. Some were, like me, thrown out, and some got out through the doors. I collected them together. We knew exactly what we were supposed to do, although we didn't at that moment, of course, know where we were the first glider to land, or the second, or the third, because 3 were destined to land at our particular bridge. I took the platoon forward to where I knew the bridge was and the road running up to it, and there, crouching in the ditch, was my company commander, who said quite simply, "David, number 2." And I knew that number 2's job was to cross the road and sort out the enemy on the other side in the, I think we would call them the inner defences of the bridge. There was an enormous amount of noise by this time going on, because 25 platoon under Den Brotheridge, who had landed just before me, were already crossing the bridge. And it was part of the training that we would make a lot of noise, I suppose partly to frighten the enemy, and partly to identify each other in the dark. My platoon, for instance, everywhere it went shouted, "Baker, Baker, Baker," so that the other platoons would know who it was. The whole thing was over very quickly, and I heard the magic words "ham and jam" on my, I think it was a 38 set radio, because that was carried by my batman. And as we were, I think, consolidating, my company commander came up on the radio and said I was to report to him on the road for further orders. So taking my batman with me, and for some reason the platoon sergeant, Sergeant Leather, had joined us, I started to make my way back to my company commander. When I was hit in the leg by what turned out to be a burst of 3 rounds of Smiger machine pistol, and fell to the ground, quite unable to do anything, I was extremely frightened. The grass was long, and I thought at any minute the chap who had fired at me was going to come and finish me off. So I shouted loudly. I didn't know at the time that both my batman and my platoon sergeant had been shot at the same time. But quite quickly a couple of men in the platoon came up, and they did what they could for my leg, put a rifle splint on it and gave me some morphine. And I was really then effectively out of the action.
We took off at 2300 hours on June the 5th. Knowing where we were going, roughly, we knew we were going north coast of France, and what could one do? Just sat in there, and it was obvious that the whole 6th Airborne Division was on the move, and I could only picture it, surmise myself, that each aircraft that went up was allocated a space, and it was almost 1 o'clock in the next morning before we dropped. So for 2 hours we were up there, obviously all these planes had to fit in and get into one huge armada and then set off en bloc. Well, I suppose it seemed like forever, and I know for one, I thought, for God's sake, when do we get out of this thing? So I think as we approached the coast, and I can only surmise this, of course, the underside of the aircraft was hit with something. It wasn't fatal, but I distinctly felt a few thuds under my feet where I was standing, and a bit of evasive action, and sort of threw all the chaps around a bit, and a bit of choice language, I think. Anyway, it levelled out, and wasn't very long after this that the dispatcher was there, the hole was open, then word would come back from the pilot to the dispatcher, and the red light would come on. That meant everybody get to their stations, and then however long that was held for, sometimes perhaps half a minute, and then when the pilot realised he was in the right spot, he'd press his button and the green light would come on, and from then on it was all hell let loose, really. But I do remember being so relieved to be out of the belly of that aircraft. I mean, it was rather claustrophobic, and as I say, you could hardly see one another. So, fresh air at last.
When we left the dropping zone, our rendezvous, we were extremely alarmed because C Company had only 30 men, and we were very short in numbers. But the CO said we couldn't stay there much longer, we had to get cracking. But when we reached our defensive position, south of the Labarre de Ronville, to our delight, we found a hell of a lot of chaps there already established and digging in like mad. Such was our briefing in England that every soldier knew exactly where he's going to dig his hole and his arcs of fire. It was so clear on the aerial photographs. And so there was no briefing required. The soldier went straight to his little area and started digging in. And the bulk of the battalion were there already digging in. They had been scattered in their drop beyond the dropping zone, and with all this kit that they had to carry, they weren't going to flog all the way back to the rendezvous of the dropping zone and then flog back again to the defensive locality, so they took a short cut and got themselves established.